That's much better. Welcome. Welcome. I'm Victor Curran, and I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord and our co-sponsor, Thoreau Farm, the birthplace of Henry David Thoreau. It's a special treat to welcome Richard Higgins here. It was through First Parish that I first got to know Rich more than 20 years ago. And more than 15 years ago, Rich's wife, Reverend Jenny Rankin, gathered together several people who shared her interest in the Concord Transcendentalists. And that assembly became the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord. And since then, our group has been planning and presenting events that educate about and celebrate the people and events that made Concord a center of American independence and imagination. Richard Higgins is a writer, book coach, and the author or editor of 4 books, including his new one, Thoreau's God, from the University of Chicago Press, and that explores Thoreau's iconoclastic religious vision. He also wrote Thoreau and the Language of Trees, about Thoreau's multifaceted love of trees, and he's the co-author of Portfolio Life and a volume editor of Taking Faith Seriously from Harvard University Press. He's a former staff writer for the Boston Globe. He lives here in Concord, and he and his wife raised their 3 children here. Richard is on the board of directors of the Thoreau Society. He's a graduate of Holy Cross, Columbia Journalism School, and the Harvard Divinity School. He's written for publications including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Christian Century, and American Scholar. There's just a couple of housekeeping things that I'd like to let you know before we start. There will be Q&A at the end of Richard's presentation. If you are joining us on Zoom, just use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to open the chat window, and you can put your questions in there. After the Q&A, there will be a reception downstairs in the parish hall. For those of you new to this building, go through that door and down the stairs. That will take you to the parish hall. So there will be a reception there with refreshments, and there will be Richard's books, Thoreau's God and Thoreau and the Language of Trees, available for sale and signing. And if you are watching on Zoom, we'll put a link in the chat to the Thoreau Society shop at Walden Pond, where you can get Richard's books there. So please join me in welcoming Richard Higgins.
Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you for coming, and a warm welcome to those of you joining us on Zoom. As Victor mentioned, there's going to be a question and answer period, so listen carefully because I'm going to have a lot of questions. I still don't understand all this stuff. I want to say that this is a special day for me for 2 reasons. The second is that this is the official publication day of the book, so nice to share that with you. And the first is that it's my 36th wedding anniversary with my guiding star, Jenny Rankin. Well, it's an honor to speak here in this church, which played such a large role in Thoreau's life, albeit mostly negatively, I have to say, but also indirectly positively a little bit, as I will try to explain. It was here that Thoreau was baptized, although not by his choice, as he later noted, on October 12th, 1837, and where he went to Sunday school. Thoreau didn't like schools or churches, and a church school was definitely not up his alley. But it gave him a familiarity with the Bible, which would deepen over his life and become a key part of his unique literary style. He used the language of the Bible kind of subversively to take it back from its institutional custodians and reframe it for his readers. And it's where he heard about the ideal of Christianity. Thoreau thought the respectable churches in his day failed that ideal, even opposed it, but he had never actually completely gave up on it. In 1844, when no one else would do it, Thoreau pulled down the rope in the vestibule back there and rang the church bell to summon neighbors to Emerson's first anti-slavery lecture. You can see that very bell on the church lawn when you leave, which is where it fell when the previous meeting house burned down here in 1900. And it was here that Thoreau's funeral was held, again, one has to note, without his permission, after which 300 Concord school children bearing wildflowers followed his coffin to the grave. For me, a persuasive testimony to Thoreau's much maligned personality and character. If children like and respect you, then that's a pretty good sign. But most famously, this is the church that he firmly left on January 6, when at the age of 23, he strode down Concord's snow-covered streets to deliver a frank note to the town clerk, Cyrus Snow, saying he did not wish to be considered a member of First Parish. Although it's often called Thoreau's resignation, excuse me, I'm just going to get my water. It's called Thoreau's resignation, but he actually didn't resign because he insisted that he had never joined in the first place. So all of this suggests that Thoreau's God, the title of my book, is an oxymoron. But I think it's more complicated than that, and that it's better understood as a riddle, which is how I present it in my book and tonight. Excuse me. It's true that Thoreau called his Calvinist heritage an ancient and tottering frame with all its boards blown off. He found its doctrines despairing, its clergy cowardly, its rituals superstitious, and its God remote yet all-controlling. His attacks on organized religion, together with his defiant pluralism, nature mysticism, and his reluctance to define his innermost religious feelings, have contributed to the view that he was a secular force of nature, spiritual maybe, but only in some vague, eclectic way, grounded entirely in the natural world and unmoored from any common understanding of religion. Now, that view is not without justification, but I think it more likely projects the predominant secularism of our culture and academic studies in particular. I say that because it omits the palpable, undeniable presence of divine mystery in Thoreau's writing. I don't mean his polemical writings about religion. I mean his sincere and searching remarks about God and his occasional emotional speech to God in his journal and letters. Those are moments when we get a glimpse of his capacious soul. Thoreau was religious to the bone and had a profound sense of the holy. If his views were iconoclastic, and they were, his experience of the divine in nature was rapturous. He disavowed systematic theology, but he spoke of and sought communion with a mystery at the heart of the universe that was at once immanent or present in nature and yet transcendent. Explaining that secret to others was not important. Experiencing it was what mattered. Formal religion with its doctrines and creeds was irrelevant to the religion he sought in nature, a religion by revelation, as Emerson called it, or as Thoreau put it, a newer testament, the gospel according to this moment. In slighting this deep vein in Thoreau, we miss an essential part of who he was. His religious sensibility was a central thread in his life and is woven through his works. Woven through his scalding critiques of slavery, racism, our materialist culture, and our exploitation of natural resources. It grounds his philosophical views on government and how we relate to the natural world. And it gives us a better sense of who he was, what he was about, and what motivated him. Now, to understand this side of Thoreau, We have to look beyond his formal beliefs and affiliations, or lack thereof. Religion for Thoreau was a way of living and a fundamental attitude about life, one of openness to divine mystery and a desire to draw closer to it. It was less a compilation of beliefs than a set of internal possibilities about how to live, what to notice, and what to love. Quote, "Without religion or devotion of some kind," Thoreau wrote, "nothing great can be accomplished." Thoreau was a born seeker. He had an inherent sense of reverence, and if one reads him carefully, humility, at least regarding the holy. He bowed before nature's mysteries. "The trees," he said, "point to a place where our feet cannot take us." His keen awareness of a hidden, numinous dimension of reality, along with the religious liberalism and idealism he developed at Harvard and as a member of Concord's Transcendentalist Circle, all of this inclined him toward a spiritual outlook on life. Thoreau saw the world as either sacred or profane, and he desired as much as possible to live in the former and eschew the latter. Thoreau's spirituality was grounded in disciplined observation and sensory experience. His daily visits to the woods, fields, and waters of Concord set his spiritual wheels in motion. A cock crowing at dawn, light slanting in golden rays through a forest at sunset, the aromatic smell of pine, or a delicate robin nest could elicit his awe. Quote, "Those divine sounds," he wrote, "which are uttered to our inward ear, which are breathed in the wind or reflected from the lake, come to us noiselessly, bathing the temples of our souls as we stand motionless amid the rocks." Thoreau's experiences in nature were moments of awakening that defied what he called the common laws of everyday New England Yankee life. They were inklings of a different order of truth that turned ordinary perception upside down. He loved to listen, for example, to the eerie, wail-like sounds emitted by telegraph poles as the wires vibrated in the wind, sounds he often described as coming from heaven or on high or another world. The message that he heard in the music, as he called it, of the telegraph poles, quote, "stings my ear with everlasting truth. It always intoxicates me, makes me sane, reverses my views of things." While these moments of union with the ultimate were authoritative for Thoreau, they were also inexpressible, or nearly so. Emerson understood this. "Our faith comes in moments," he wrote. "Our vice is habitual. Yet there is a depth in those brief moments which constrains us to ascribe more reality to them than to all other experiences." Close quote. Although such moments were a fraction of Thoreau's life, they formed a foundation for the rest of it. Thoreau knew that these visitations of spiritual truth came unbidden, but he believed that certain practices and habits of mind could make him more ready to receive them. It was less what he did, examining a pine cone, communing with frogs in a swamp, hoeing beans, or simply sitting in silence, than the attitude with which he did it that cultivated his soul. His spiritual practices included walking, close observation of nature, meditation, reading his beloved classics, and faithfully keeping his journal. But Thoreau also had a sense of what William James called, quote, "the reality of the unseen," an invisible realm toward which Thoreau said he was drawn by a, quote, "continual drift and instinct to all my shores." Quote, "I was always conscious of sounds in nature which my ears could never hear, that I caught but the prelude to a strain. She always retreats as I advance. Away and behind is she and her meaning. I never saw to the end, nor heard to the end, but the best part was unseen and unheard. Thoreau disdained the abstract, labyrinthine systems of thought that Christianity and other religions have tended to produce over the centuries. If Thoreau believed anything, it was that all forms of life are unified by a creative energy unbounded by space and time. But it was the believing, not the particular belief, that was important to him. Quote, that we have but little faith is not sad, but that we have but little faithfulness, he wrote his Worcester friend and disciple Harry Blake in 1848. By faithfulness, faith is earned. Emerson wrote that the soul never reasons, never proves, it simply perceives. This was an article of faith for Thoreau. His spiritual experience was rooted in direct, unmediated perception. To Thoreau, faith happens when we, this is a quote, when we do not have to believe, but come into contact with the truth in a direct and intimate way, close quote. Faith is also fluid, less a conviction of the mind than a motion of the soul for Thoreau. People show their faith or lack of it in how they live, he thought. Quote, the only faith that men recognize is a creed. But the true creed, which we unconsciously live by, and which rather adopts us than we it, is quite different from the written or preached one. Thoreau doubted that the highest truths could be captured in rational discourse. To frame God in objective terms is to put our knowledge above God's transcendence. A God whose veil can be ripped aside by the human mind is not a God worthy of being reverenced. Quote, the destiny of the soul can never be studied by reason, for its modes are not ecstatic, Thoreau wrote. Quote, I cannot convince myself, God must convince, close quote. In this respect, Thoreau is allied with the mystical tradition known as negative or apophatic theology, also called the via negativa. Apophatic is from the Greek for no speech and refers to the belief that, although we may know God intuitively, no quality or attribute of God can be posited with confidence. According to the Jewish theologian and mystic Abraham Joshua Heschel, negative theology, quote, claims that we can never say what God is, we can only say what God is not. Thoreau was also deeply influenced by ancient Hindu texts, in particular the Bhagavad Gita, which he called one of the noblest and most sacred scriptures that have come down to us, worthy of being reverenced even by Yankees. He learned from the Gita about the value of right or disinterested action, which isn't quite void of motive. Rather, it's doing what we are called to do, irrespective of the outcome, as a path to self-transformation. Thoreau was drawn to the Vedic texts of India by their openness to change, their admission of uncertainty, and their acknowledgement of the mysterious nature of the divine. Quote, in their very indistinctness, a sublime truth is implied, he wrote in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. Quote, it hardly allows the reader to rest in any supreme first cause, but directly it hints at a supremer one still, which created the last. Now, excuse me. I don't see Thoreau as a confirmed theist, but I do think he was open to and sought union with a divine mystery that was at once immanent in nature and yet not contained by it. He called this illimitable presence many names, but he actually often called it God, something he did more than commonly appreciated, which is one reason I began this book. I should add that Thoreau was ambivalent about the word God. It was tarnished by starchy piety and conveyed too much certainty about something he saw as ineffable, or that which surpasses the capacity of language to express it. Thoreau used the word God in a letter to his Worcester friend Blake, and then he appeared to have second thoughts about it. Thoreau wrote, "Let God alone if need be. Leave God alone if need be. Methinks if I loved him more, I should keep him, I should keep myself rather, at a more respectful distance. It is not when I'm going to meet him, but just when I am turning away and leaving him alone, that I discover that God is. I say God. I am not sure that is the name. You will know whom I mean." Yet while Thoreau insisted on that ineffability as a religious thinker, as a literary artist, which was his main vocation in life, he somewhat paradoxically used figurative imagery to portray God as the ultimate creative force. Indeed, it's remarkable that the word God, uppercase, appears more than 250 times in the Princeton edition of Thoreau's journal, the 8 volumes in print and the online transcripts, excluding editorial matter and common expressions. Thoreau referred to the idea of God many more times if one includes his poetic references to the great artist, the great maker, the great teacher, and his other poetic names for God. Now, the number, it's true, does not really mean very much. God was a part of the furniture of the mind in Thoreau's day, and many of those 250 uses are pro forma or even sarcastic, as when he mocks the speech of unbearably pious persons, which he likes to do. However, it is fair to say that in the majority of cases, Thoreau refers to God without cant or question, and a smaller but still significant number of those references stand out as thoughtful, deliberate, and poignant speech about a benevolent but also disorienting presence that Thoreau seeks to know, wonders about, is shaken by, derives happiness from, and thrills to experience. Thoreau's God was an infinite, life-giving presence. It was a God of wildness, surprise, and change, and yet it was at the same time benign and loving. Now, in moments of ecstasy, he wrote with an emotional certainty about this source, but his belief in a personal God was contingent, never final, more of a moving toward than an arriving at. However tentative his conviction, Thoreau's fleeting glimpses and tastes of the divine deeply moved him and fueled his religious imagination. I mentioned earlier that Thoreau found God in the beauty and harmony of the natural world, as have many mystics before him. In the breezes that rippled Walden Pond, the gem-like colors of a pickerel, the buds that swell in spring, and the leaves in autumn that teach us how to die. But Thoreau also experienced God in the claw and tooth of nature, in its chaos, decay, and predation, in the storms that level trees, the waves that crush ships, and the wild dive of the hawk at its prey. Thoreau saw a radical otherness and transformative wildness in God. It was the ungovernable and inexhaustible spirit of life itself, and it was holy. Quote, "There is in my nature, methinks, a singular yearning toward all wildness," he wrote in a week. To connect with it was to be fully human for Thoreau. In his essay, Walking, he wrote, "The most alive is the wildest." The wild, as Thoreau conceived of it, was a regenerative, remedial, and liberating spiritual force that is both in us and at the same time larger than us. Quote, "The Almighty," he wrote in his journal, "is wild above all." Thoreau's ideas about God evolved from the more personal theism of his youth, of his early writings in the 1830s after he graduated from Harvard in 1837, to a more integrative conception of divinity in the 1850s that merged the mystical and the material. Such differences were of degrees, however, and his theological thought did not evolve in a straight line. While he wrote about a personal God more often in the period before Walden appeared, his earliest journal entries also have passages in which his consciousness is mystically identified with natural processes, and his writings after Walden are punctuated by what Larry Buell has called his pop-up theism, or references to a personal creator. And these continue to appear as late as 1861, when Thoreau wrote the abolitionist minister Parker Pillsbury, "Blessed are they who never read a newspaper, for they shall see nature, and through her, God." Thoreau was also inconsistent. He sometimes spoke in diffuse terms about an impersonal, abstract, divine mind and nature, saying the pond has intelligence with a remote horizon in Walden. Very similar to Emerson's oversoul, or that intelligence in which the universe, or that intelligence in the universe to which every soul has access. William James actually called this theology Emersonianism. Quote, "Not a deity in concreto, not a superhuman person, but the immanent divinity in all things, the essentially spiritual structure of the universe." Thoreau, however, was also stamped by his Puritan heritage and consistently drew on its theological frameworks to conceive in creative ways of a personal creator God. This was not the distant God of deism, remote from the world it spun into being. Thoreau speaks of a divine mystery to which he feels personally related. Instead of the foreboding and distant deity of his childhood, sweeping down from on high as a judge, the God Thoreau knew was close at hand, woven into every twig, trunk, and blade. It was this interior feeling of being related to the source of life that was the taproot of religion for Thoreau. He gives fullest expression to that view in Walden, indeed making the pond a symbol of God. Thoreau is struggling with how to divorce the religious sentiment from its institutional context in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. By Walden, he has figured it out. Transcendence is woven through the book's vision of the natural world. In the chapter Solitude, for example, he writes, quote, "Nearest to all things is that power which fashions their being. Next to us, the grandest laws are continually being executed. Next to us is not the workmen whom we have hired, with whom we love to talk so well, but the workmen whose work we are." When it came to proving God's existence, however, Thoreau was uninterested. Apologies for God showed bad faith, he thought. He also seemed to think that elaborate arguments were only needed to prove a dubious assertion, whereas the truth stood alone, naked and alone, quite well. Although the creativity of Thoreau's religious thought and its centrality to his life's work is increasingly being recognized by scholars, and I stand on their shoulders, Alan Hodder and many others, Thoreau did not leave a clearly marked or easy-to-follow spiritual path. Indeed, his spirituality is characterized by a series of baffling paradoxes. He was a deeply religious person without a religion. He rejected the personality of God, but at times portrayed a personal creator. He was an ultra-radical reformer who held a sacramental view of nature. He saw historical Christianity as a failure, but framed his religious views in its scripture and verse. He said, "Our spirits never go beyond nature," and he also said, "We must look through and beyond nature." He so loved the earth that he looked forward to being buried in its soil, yet he alluded to heaven as a metaphor literally hundreds of times in his journal, and some 48 times in Walden, including all heavens, heavenly, etc. Perhaps the main paradox is this last one, the tension between his palpable love of this green earth and his yearning for a mystical dimension of reality he describes variously, as I've said, as another world or that other world or a distant shore. Several times he said that the actual world of sensory experience seemed less real to him than this intuited one. Now, this is pretty hard to square with the more familiar earthbound Thoreau, who indeed was at home in nature and who saw the natural world as a source of physical, mental, and spiritual health. But Thoreau's mysticism did not conflict with his passion for the earth. There is another world, Thoreau tells us, but it is hidden in the heart of this one that we think we know so well. Having concluded that matter is holy, studying it became an act of contemplation and veneration. As Thoreau studied marigolds in the 1850s, his materialism was his mysticism. Both his field work and his spiritual quest were motivated by a desire to detect the anima, or soul, in everything. William James defined religion as the, quote, feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider divine. Thoreau spoke plainly of being in relation to such a source in a letter to Blake. And his letters to Blake do have far more of his religious and theological thought than, well, quite a bit of it is in the journal, but it's quite a lot of it in his letters to Harrison Blake. So he writes Blake one day in 1851, quote, "I believe something, and there is nothing else but that. I know that I am. I know that another is who knows more than I, who takes an interest in me, whose creature and yet whose kindred, in one sense, am I. I know that the enterprise is worthy. I know that things work well. I have heard no bad news." I just love that. I'll conclude with some brief remarks on Thoreau's influence today. Although Thoreau's spiritual quest was a personal one, he did not keep it to himself. His writings and the example of his life blazed a trail that many others have sought to travel. Quote, 50 years from now, Thoreau wrote in 1850, quote, "The majority of people will believe as I do now," close quote. Thoreau was off by roughly a century and by how many people might share his beliefs, but his audacious prophecy was remarkably prescient. Spiritual seekers today are discovering a chord of recognition in Thoreau's eclectic, experiential, and non-institutional spirituality. He appeals to people looking, as the late great nature writer Barry Lopez wrote, quote, "for anyone who could speak the language of the God of no particular religion," close quote. This is not because Thoreau's religious views are being newly discovered, but because American culture has come round to embrace them. Indeed, I think that Thoreau's religious naturalism is an element in his popularity today. Thoreau is not unique in the annals of religious history or even the 19th century. He stands in a long line of liberalizing reformers, including Protestant forerunners such as Jan Hus or John Wycliffe, the Unitarian martyr Michael Servetus, the Quaker mystic George Fox, the Romantic poets, and of course, his fellow transcendentalists, especially Emerson, and indirectly the German theologian Schleiermacher, all of whom sought a truer, more interior form of religion. Thoreau's religious thought bears lesser or greater relation to them, but he mostly formulated his religious views from his own experience rather than his reading. If Thoreau has greater influence today in American religion and the current religious moment than those fellow freethinkers, it's because he articulated that liberal religious vision with an originality, courage, clarity, sincerity, vividness, and beauty that few have. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm curious about Thoreau's view of his family members who who I believe were members of the Tricon split, a
Yes.
more Orthodox Christianity. What were their relationships like with each other? Because they lived together, right?
They did live together. And the expert on that is sitting in the front row, historian Bob Gross, who studied this divisiveness and its influence on Thoreau. His family, belonged to this church, and then in 1826, possibly 1827, when the conservatives got really fed up with the liberal direction that this church was taking, the more Unitarian view. They left, they founded the Tricon Trinitarian Church next door. They literally went across the little bridge here over the mill dam to congregate. And Cynthia, his mother, and 3 of his aunts were among those who did it. Cynthia later regretted her choice and came back to First Parish. And she actually would not, one reason she did not stay in the Trinitarian Church was that she had to take a vow of obedience or belief in Jesus as her Savior and Lord or something. And she just didn't feel in good conscience she could do it. And under great pressure from her aunts and whatnot, she stood by what she believed and returned to this church. And that one has to think that had an influence on Thoreau. As to what they talked about at the dinner table, I can't say, but as I say in the book, he was marinated in religion, and they were very strong. It was a very contentious time. But he observed it all, and it's very likely that's one reason he was so down on organized religion, that it just led to this fighting. So.
First of all, Richard, this is really, really good, and I thank you for writing this book,
Thank you.
which I do want to read. When you said that, Thoreau said that, I know there's another world inside this natural world that we all hold so close and holy. Makes me think that he did believe in a God.
Well, he was unquestionably a mystic. He called himself a mystic in response to a survey where he called himself a transcendentalist, a mystic, and maybe a mystic to boot. I'm forgetting the order, but he definitely had a sensitivity to what was beyond visible sight. He had a very, acute awareness of what's called the numinous, the holy dimension of reality. And when he was at Harvard, he taught for a while in his, his sophomore year in Canton, Mass, and lived for, 6 weeks with a very fiery Unitarian minister named Orestes Bronson. And Orestes was a real radical in those days, and he was publishing a work that basically was saying that matter and spirit are one. And Thoreau really absorbed that from him and developed that idea through the rest of his life.
Okay. Two things, thoughts kept recurring to me. One was, I didn't hear anything about influences of his fellow transcendentalists in either direction. And the other was some of the quotes that you were saying made me wonder, was he partaking of any natural substances while he was out there wandering around nature?
I think we can fairly well assume that Thoreau was clean and sober. He was not he wouldn't drink, he drank tea, but coffee, spirits, tobacco, sugar, no way. Okay, well, I don't know. I tend to think that he naturally was in tune with these other dimensions, and it was not a psychotropic or whatever experience. He was thunderstruck in his junior year by Emerson's Nature, which proposed that, his book Nature, which proposed that nature was an organic language of spirit. It had some connection with Swedenborgian thought at that time, and it had a huge influence on Thoreau. Most of what a lot of what he learned was, he didn't like read Schleiermacher, or actually, well, he was very influenced by Wordsworth, who was a romantic and had some transcendentalist thought to him. But he sort of absorbed it by osmosis from his circle that he was in, with Bronson Alcott, Ellery Channing, Emerson, Margaret Fuller. And yeah, no, so I think transcendentalism, he called himself a transcendentalist, and it did greatly influence him.
I think we have some questions from the Zoom chat.
Okay?
Okay, so this is the first question from the online community. Rich, how might the contact passage from the Mount Katahdin essay illuminate Thoreau's religious perspective?
Okay. Actually, there's something in the book about that. Let's see. Yeah, so in 1846, Thoreau climbed Mount Katahdin, and some of this is, I'm just sort of paraphrasing what's in the book, where he encountered what he called a primeval, untamed, and forever untamable power over which humans have no control. And he really felt he had wandered into the, factory of the gods, and was uncomfortable and felt chastened by the experience. But as if he had trespassed into nature's innermost sanctum. It was a step too far for him. But when he wrote about that experience in Concord several months later, he described the raw, weather-beaten summit as a sacred place, quote, a specimen of what God saw fit to make the world. So wildness did have a spiritual dimension to him, and he believed that when we align ourselves to the wild nature, we align ourselves to God.
There's two more questions, and I'll combine them. One is from Dennis. Dennis says, Rich, you may remember the talk you gave on Thoreau's belief in the divine in the Masonic Hall about 10 years ago. So impressive to me. Have you found new inspirations since then? Have your views changed? And then Robert Thorson writes, when working on this book, what was the most pivotal moment that led you to its outcome?
Well, I think I could sort of answer both by just saying that the depth of Thoreau's commitment to living as spiritual a life as he could, but also his aspiration to follow the path wherever it took him. He's just remarkably dedicated to his spiritual betterment. It's there's a happiness movement today that one of the mantras is, don't try to be happy, try to be happier. And Thoreau was always aspiring to grow spiritually, and certainly he inspired that in me. I mean, I really take him as a spiritual teacher. Sometimes I felt a little like he really showed me how much further I have to go on the spiritual path, sort of like one of those Puritans that dozed off in the pew and they had to be tapped awake by a deacon with a long rod, that kind of thing, but mostly inspired by him. I think that, Thoreau wouldn't refused the idea of fitting God into a theological shoebox, and that very much resonates with me, and his sense of religion as a personal and emotional commitment, not an assent to a proposition, also very much spoke to me. But I think his realizing the depth, the seriousness, the full commitment to this living this spiritual path was what really struck me. I wanted to read something from the book about that. There's a section where Thoreau, let me find this. Thoreau revisits the deep cut, which is the embankment that the railroad made digging through Concord to create the tracks. And so he goes back there and he writes, "As I was entering the deep cut, the wind, which was conveying a message to me from heaven, dropped it on the wire of the telegraph, which the pole vibrated to him as I passed. I instantly sat down on a stone at the foot of the telegraph pole and attended to the communication. It said, 'Bear in mind, child, and never for an instant forget that there are higher planes, infinitely higher planes of life than this thou art now traveling on. Know that the goal is distant and is upward and is worthy of all your life's efforts to attain to it.' And then it ceased, and though I sat some minutes longer, I heard nothing more." I think that's very beautiful. And just one other, Thoreau said, "My desire for knowledge is intermittent." Okay, so wishing to know things rationally is intermittent. "But my desire to commune with the spirit of the universe, to be intoxicated even with the fumes of that divine nectar, to bear my head through atmospheres and over heights unknown to my feet, is perennial and constant." So coming into touch with that deep aspiration was very inspiring to me.
Thank you, Richard. Are there any more questions online or in the room? There's a question back here.
Thank you. I was in your presentation in the library. Wanted to ask you, I heard something that the publisher decides how to form the book. So I saw you have a reflection of the word God on the front cover.
Yes,
Like in the water or in the pond.
right?
Is that your idea or they kind of?
That was somewhat their idea. I like the cover. It's actually my photograph. I took that photograph, but I don't. I like it. It's something a little more subtle would have been good for me. But when you're an author, there's two things that, the cover and the title are things that the publisher regards as a marketing thing that they are going to control. So, and the other thing is you deal with these, young editorial designers, very lovely young people, but, you sometimes just have no idea if they have any sense what your book is about. So I'm very pleased to announce that Julia Whalen, who's a very popular narrator of audiobooks, is doing the audiobook for Thoreau's God. And the audiobook, her company, Audioberry, has a lovely cover, which I can come to Cafe Nero and show it to you sometime, showing a trail going off a mountain, going up high and into the clouds and disappearing. And that, I think that's lovely too. So.
And the one thing you might have heard, some consider Henry David as the first American yogi, and also where he says, I'm Pythagorean, not eating beans. How you
Well, I
consider
won't get into
those
his relationship with beans, but I will say that I don't know if he was not certainly the first American mystic, but Thoreau did call himself a yogin. A yogin was the term that he used in a letter to Blake. So here's a little passage about Thoreau as a mystic, and if there are no other questions, I'll read it. He's just knocked the idea of the conservative God of the respectable Christianity in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. And he writes, but the true God, he writes in A Week, is something else. Quote, the perfect God, in his revelations of himself, has never got to the length of one such proposition as you, his prophets, state, close quote. All the gods ever worshipped have been men, Thoreau wrote in his journal in 1849, quote, but the true God, of whom none have conceived, all men combined would hardly furnish the germ, quote, close quote. The important words in that sentence are, of whom none have conceived. Thoreau's knowledge of God was mystical. It drew on a kind of holy ignorance, or as the anonymous 14th century monk who wrote The Cloud of Unknowing, wrote in his handbook on contemplative prayer, a blind thrust through a cloud of unknowing, or groping in the dark. Thoreau repeatedly asserts that God is unfathomable mystery, like the secret concealed in the snowy wood that he walked through on January 30, 1841, which I mentioned in chapter 1, I alluded to in my talk. There are long rows of trees that are embowered, like bent over with snow, so they create the effect of this kind of an arch, and they put Thoreau in the mind of the aisles of the cathedral. And he says he expects to hear choirs chanting, and then he says, quote, you are never so far in them as they are far before you, quote, of the trees. Their secret is where you are not, and where your feet can never carry you. So that's the mystical side of Thoreau, and he did say that to Blake, he did call himself a yogin. So.
Thank
Well,
you, Richard.
thank you.
We have. Can you take one more
Surely,
question? We have
surely.
one on Zoom.
There are a lot of questions still, but I'll combine two. One is, how does the Gita specifically influence Thoreau's belief in God? And then another one is, did Thoreau consider Walden Pond a sacred place?
Yeah, Thoreau absolutely considered Walden a sacred place. The pond was really a symbol of the divine in many ways. I think he says that the bream, which is a kind of fish in the pond, is another emanation or image of God, maybe in 1858. The first part of the question was what? Sorry, the
Gita,
yeah.
The Gita,
So
yeah.
the Gita, yeah, is very influential. In a sense, Thoreau was very big on one's dharma, on doing what one is called to do, doing one's duty. And the Gita is all about Arjuna, the warrior, who resists going to war because he's going to kill his relatives and teachers and whatnot, and wanting to shrink and retire, being taught or educated by Krishna, who reveals himself to Arjuna as Lord Krishna, and teaches him that to do what is his duty to do, regardless of the outcome. There's kind of side issue that he says you can neither kill nor be killed because he's going to be reincarnated. So that kind of removes some of that aspect of it. But it was central to Thoreau's idea of himself as an artist, that you do what you have to do. You write what you have to write, regardless of what kind of praise or whatever. I mean, Thoreau was not terribly successful in his lifetime, obviously. He kind of resented that Emerson was going around the country and the world lecturing, and he could barely get a lecture in Fitchburg or whatever. And he kind of turned against it. I have a theory, actually, that relates to this question, which is that Thoreau drew somewhat inward in, well, all of his life, but especially from about 1855 to 59. And I think that he began to think of his journal as a book that would publish itself. It was what his special calling was to do. And boy, was he faithful about it. Every morning writing it. And these are just beautifully turned, I mean, incredibly rich essays. Each one just spun out of his hand. And just like, and he has the metaphor or, the allegory in Walden of the artist of Kuru. And Kuru, the artist of Kuru is where the Gita takes place. That's the land. And the artist of Kuru spends an eternity making his staff, but it's what he is compelled to do, and he's indifferent to the passage of time or anything else. So that's called dharma, righteousness, doing what you're called to do, and it had a huge influence on Thoreau. And I think that he expected his journal to be published. He said at the end, he said that he wouldn't. Well, he said the only great publishers at the end are Time and Company, meaning Time, but making an allusion to Time and Brothers or something like that. But Time was the only great publisher. So I think he was very influenced and very touched by the Gita.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all for your.
Thank you.
Thank you for your good questions, Richard. Thank you for your very thoughtful
Absolutely.
answers.
It was a
invite
great
you all,
pleasure to share this with you.
who are here in the room with us to join us downstairs for the reception. Richard's books, Thoreau in the Language of Trees, and his new book, Thoreau's God, will be available for sale and signing. Those of you watching us on Zoom, have a cookie and a glass of wine. And thank you for your questions.